Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Harmonic Justice, an evening of classical music and conversation in support of racial justice. I'm Cherise Fano-Burdine, one of 3 executive partners at the Pretrial Justice Institute, and we are thrilled to welcome you here tonight. I am also a new board member of the National Philharmonic and excited to be here in that capacity as well. Tonight's event, which we are so excited about, was made possible with funding from the Art for Justice Fund. And we deeply appreciate that investment in this conversation. Wendy of our team is going to pop a link in the chat to the Art to Justice Fund. That's also an example of Wendy's role here tonight. She will be providing links to things that come up tonight so that you will have an opportunity to visit those either during the event or after. We are also excited to share with you that after tonight's event, starting at a little bit after 8 o'clock, we will be adjourning to a green room where we will have the opportunity to take a breath after this event. It'll be set up like a meeting instead of a webinar. So right now, today, you'll just see the panelists. But in the green room afterwards, where we'll give you an opportunity to step into your kitchen and grab your favorite beverage and come join us for a conversation. A couple of the artists will be able to stay with us. And of course, folks from PJI and NatPhil will be there as well. And we look forward to seeing folks in the green room. So this is a webinar format. If you've been on 1,000 Zooms over the last year, you will notice there is a chat function here at the bottom of your screen, and we really encourage you to put any reflections, remarks, comments, say hello, tell people where you're tuning in from in the chat box. You can select to and everyone. Just remember that it is going to everyone so that you can do panelists and attendees, and then that'll say hello to everyone in the chat. Feel free to use the crying emoji if you get moved by something that happens tonight. We're really just, there's also an applaud, a little hand clapping. You guys know all these things. So please interact with us in the chat function. We're excited about that. You don't need me to name that this year has been full of heartbreaking events. We are struggling with so much, and there is also so much to be grateful for. Both of these things can be true at the same time. All of us, but especially white people, have the obligation to understand the past, present, and future dictated by the dominance of white culture in this country. The murder of George Floyd and the ravaging of COVID-19 through communities of color are the direct result of our collective failure to come to grips with the founding of our country, its legacy of slavery, black clothes, lynching, Jim Crow laws, redlining, and the wars on drugs and poverty, which are actually wars on the people in the grips of those things. Black and Latinx folks make up a combined 32% of the US population, and yet Black and Latinx folks make up only about a combined 4.5% of orchestras. Only 4.3% of conductors are Black, and composers remain predominantly white. And Black and Latinx folks combined make up 56% of the incarcerated population, which is twice their share. So tonight, we are starting with a piece composed and performed by one of our panelists, Alysia Lee. She is joined in the piece by a virtual choir led by Eugene Rogers, Associate Professor and Director of Choral Activities at the University of Michigan's School of Music, Theater, and Dance. Let's watch.
Say her name, say her name, say her name. She cannot be forgotten by us. Say her name, 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 her name. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. Put her name in the air. 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 Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. She cannot be forgotten by us. Say her name. 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 Put her name. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. She cannot be forgotten by us. Say her name. 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 Breonna Taylor. Say her name. Tatiana Jefferson. Say her name. Say her name. Pamela Turner. Say her name. Say her name. Put his name in the air. Say his name. Philando Castile. Eric Garner. Michael Brown. Say his name. Say their name. Say their name. Say their name. Say their names. They cannot be forgotten by us. Say their names. Say their names. Say their names. Say their names. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. She cannot be forgotten by us. Say her name. 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 She cannot be forgotten by us. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name. Say her name.
Whew. Just need a second. Well, Alysia, thank you for creating something so beautiful. Panelists, come with your cameras. Alysia, thank you for creating something so beautiful and moving, and for having that be the piece that you brought to tonight's conversation. It is my honor to introduce to you all our panelists. Alysia Lee, founder and artistic director of Sister Cities Girlchoir. Hello.
Hello, thank you for having me here tonight. Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Chaz Salazar, flutist and 2020 Sphinx Futurist Fellow at the National Orchestral Institute and Festival.
Good evening.
And Garrett McQueen, bassoonist and executive producer of the TRILLOQUY podcast.
What's up, everybody? Thank you for having me here.
And Jim Kelly, president and CEO of the National Philharmonic.
Good evening.
Hello, Jim. All right. Well, this is going to be great. Welcome, all of you. So tonight we are launching a collaboration. Maybe this seems like an unusual partnership between the National Phil, the Nat Phil, as we call it in the biz, and PJI. But this will take us into 2021 and beyond. The artists that I just introduced to you tonight really live their deep connection between music and the fight for racial justice. To use their words, they jumped at the chance to participate in tonight's conversation, to reframe the knowledge and experience of classical music through a racial equity lens. Now, some of you in the audience might be saying, well, it's about time. And you'd be right, because maybe you've experienced some level of disenfranchisement in the world or in the world of classical music and have long known this is a direction and a conversation that we needed to be having. Some of you might feel like you've known there's something you needed to learn and wrestle with around racial justice this year from all the news, but you haven't found your own on-ramp to that conversation. And for some of you, this may be more of a wake-up call, but wherever you are, it is all good, and we are here to walk with you. This is a journey where everyone goes at their own speed and where we support each other. It's a really long walk and it has no end. Wendy's going to throw up a link. We've been working a lot at PJI, and so for folks who are interested in reading about that. So let's get into it. There is a large gap, I imagine, my colleagues, between how many composers of color actually exist and those who have works that are performed by orchestras, recorded for sales by the classical music industry, etc. So I'd love to start this by grounding it in lived experience. It's something we talk a lot about in the criminal justice reform space. And so I'd love to start, Alysia, asking you to do two things. One, share with us why that was the piece you selected for tonight. And then maybe if you would kick us off in sort of starting your own experience of the classical music space, how you've chosen to respond, and how all of that has impacted the personal choices you've made around projects.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity. I'm so glad we got to share the piece, Say Her Name. It's a message that really grounds us in something I strongly believe in, which is centering the voices that we don't hear often, right? And that's really almost what this conversation is about how can we not empower folks, but give space to folks that we typically push out into the margins, right? So Say Her Name is a very important piece to me. It's the first piece that I had published. I am one of those people that's all about action and doing and doing exactly what I'm asking other people to do. And so I have not been a composer before, I would say before 2020, and started to really think about this ways of being an example, right, of composing pieces. I compose pieces all the time, but I didn't publish them. I didn't share them. I shared them with my choir. We would sing them, right? But just really giving space to saying that I have a legitimate voice as a singer, as a Black woman, as a young woman, that I have a legitimate voice in the composition space. Really took me, I guess, all this time to really empower that and embody that, you know? So Say Her Name is about all of those things. It's about community. It has the power to turn a concert hall into a town hall. It has the power to not just use music as a tool for personal transformation, which I think we often do. Many of us have been personally transformed in a concert hall or even from an iPod listening experience by a beautiful piece of music, but to really think about elevating music to a place where it has the power to create social change, social transformation, which takes work, which takes dialogue, which takes empathy. And I think music does have the power to launch that. I'm such a proponent of song, so no shade, no shade to the instruments, but the power of song really allows us to center ourselves in one idea. This is a piece about police brutality against Black bodies. That's what this piece is about. There is no other interpretation of the piece. And so it demands from any choir that sung it, and many choirs in the United States are singing this piece, which is really fantastic. It demands that they learn these stories of these women, that they learn who Sandra Bland is, that they learn about Tatiana Jefferson, and that when they hear about these women and these stories and the communities that they came from, it does require you to make a decision. Am I going to be proactively anti this kind of oppression happening to my fellow citizens here in this country and in the world, or am I going to do nothing? So that those decisions and those conversations are what this piece is all about. And I think that's what classical music has always had the power to do. And somewhere along the way, we have become complacent in allowing music to drive dialogue. We've become lazy. And so I'm very happy that this piece was shared tonight. And I hope that it does, not just in performing it, but also in hearing it, that people can wrap their heads around all those different components of what makes the piece really special.
Well, thank you so much for that. And any other pieces you want to perform, we're here to listen.
Fantastic.
For sure. You should have nothing that no one hears. That's my new thing. You should have nothing.
I'm going to hold everyone here accountable to that. That sounds great. Yes. Yes. Awesome. Yeah. I think that's really important. I think that's really important to uplift and elevate the work of Black and Brown people. And so thank you so much for sharing my piece tonight.
You're welcome. Absolutely. Garrett, I'll turn to you. Talk about your sort of personal experiences and why, what you bring to classical music.
Absolutely. So when I'm asked to talk about my experiences, my personal experiences in classical music, the first thing I have to talk about is the way we use that phrase, classical music. In much of my work, you'll actually hear me say so-called classical music when we refer to the artistic aesthetics of Western Europe and what we formed here in America. But when I really use the phrase classical music, I'm talking about a classic form of music that is tied to a classic experience within a culture of people. So we have classical music that spans thousands of years in India, East Asia, across the African continent, and even here in the United States. And I'll speak a little bit more to the importance of affirming the Negro spiritual as America's classical music here in a bit. But as far as right now, when I'm asked about my experiences in classical music, I say from childhood, because I heard those spirituals in church. I heard my mother and my grandmother singing those spirituals. So my relationship with classical music is deep. My relationship with so-called classical music began when I was about in seventh grade, 12 years old. I was handed a bassoon because I felt like, a full disclosure, I felt like I was too good of a singer to join the school choir. So I decided that, well, you know what? Let me just learn to play an instrument. So, I was handed a bassoon, had no idea what it was, went home and, that was my introduction to Imani Winds. Shout out to Monica Ellis,
Shout out to them. Yeah.
one of the first people I saw playing a bassoon, when I looked it up. So, fast forward, I go through school, I go through most of my undergraduate degree, and and I majored in music education, by the way. And when it comes when it comes time to really do practicum and engage some students in real time, I realized, especially when it comes to the middle school age students, that I was not given the tools to engage kids that came from communities like from where I came from. I just was not given those tools. It didn't work for me. So at the last minute, I switched to what I felt, and at that time was impossible, into the world of performance. So I went and got a master's degree in music performance and went on to play with a number of orchestras, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, Louisville Orchestra. I spent 5 years as a member of the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra, among many other ensembles. And what I was finding was that the deeper I was entrenched in that performance world, the fewer people that looked like me I saw. I was quite often the only Black person on stage, most times the only Black person in the building. So, what I felt like I needed to do at that point, considering everything that I put into this profession, all of the practice, all of the blood, sweat, and tears. We can talk about auditioning behind the curtain and going through all that, So after putting all of that work in, I decided that I needed it to be as visible as possible. So I took every audition, I subbed everywhere, and I was on, there was a point where I was on stage 8 days a week, I used to tell people, just to make sure that young Black kids or even young Black professionals or pre-professionals saw someone that looked like them up on stage, so that they knew that this was something that A, we do, and B, something that you can do as well. So around the third season of my time at the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra, the opportunity came for me to get on radio. There was a local opening for a classical host down in Knoxville, Tennessee, and understanding, my goal of being as visible as possible, I knew that that was my opportunity to share not only my skills and my practice, but my voice and my perspective in real time. So I went out for that job. I got it. What I didn't know at the time was that that was the beginning of a complete shift away from the stage and into broadcast media and content creation. So, I've foregrounded new music and music by Black composers and women and composers of color. It was the main part of my work, not a sprinkling in, not something that I included, but the bulk of it. There were many days that only featured Black composers or only featured women on my show down in Knoxville. And that attention to diversity got a lot of attention across the board. So I started giving public talks, I started giving seminars and doing consultation, and it even put me on the national spotlight. I was invited to apply for a national radio position, which actually brought me here to Minnesota, where I am now. So, as I continue to foreground, my perspective and my opinions when it comes to classical programming, I began to, get to find some friction at my job, and I was eventually dismissed from that position for the way that I programmed, for the way that I equitably programmed under the under the allegation that I was going against protocol. So since being dismissed from that job about 2.5, 3 months ago, what was always my sort of side hustle, which was the consultation and the public speaking and the content creation, has become my main gig. And I have to say, being free, being off the plantation has been something that I've enjoyed so much. And as I continue to move forward, my goal is to really, as Alysia said, give space to people who have been pushed into the margins by classical music. So in addition, again, to, creating programs independently for radio stations and compiling playlists and giving interviews, my main bread and butter is my podcast and my LLC, TRILLOQUY, co-hosted by Scott Blankenship. Shout out to him. In that show, what I do is I bring conversations and I bring individuals onto the show and into the conversation that sort of highlight corners of the field that have never been foregrounded or have never really been at the center of conversations before. Last week on my show, I was honored to feature this year's Pulitzer Prize winner, Anthony Davis, and we talked a little bit about his music at the intersection of police brutality and classical music. So, my response to classical music, so-called classical music, has always been visibility. It's been that since I have been a performer. Now that I've been a few years into the content creation and the broadcast media, that idea of visibility is still what I foreground, just through the awareness lens, through making sure people hear and understand these stories, and to make sure that, we're no longer taking a back seat. It was not an easy decision for me to decide to put down the bassoon professionally to do this sort of work. But I think, anyone who has gone through that audition process and has worked to be a professional performing instrumentalist, anyone who has gone through that, and many people who have not, understand how big of a deal that is, and I really want to make sure that I make that point. It was not at all an easy decision for me to put down what I thought I was going to do for the rest of my life, but I saw a need. I saw stories that weren't being told, and I saw manifestations of racism that I felt like I can shine a light on in an effort to inspire in the minds of people in positions of power to make those changes. So it's really my honor to be here and to share my perspective. If I can leave folks with anything in this part of the presentation, it's to not be afraid to really shift what you're doing to meet a need. Playing the bassoon is something that I fell in love with. It didn't directly impact the changes I wanted to make, so I shifted my career to do that. So thank you so much for the time.
Garrett, between you and Alysia so far already, and I know when we get to Chaz and Jim, I mean, we could do hours just with you guys one-on-one. So for everyone in the audience who's already frustrated that we are not going like long and deep into everything, trust me, we all feel it. We all would rather, and we have a whole year's worth of programming. So if we can get these folks back, depends on how much y'all clap in the chat. I've not seen a lot of clapping going on in the chat. I see a lot of comments, but not a lot of clapping. So if you want to clap, maybe we can get these guys to participate over the next year. So much I could have dug into with both of that. But Chaz, I want to bring you into this conversation. be as visible as possible is like probably one of my new tattoos. So Garrett, thanks. That's like a totally winnable thing.
Make sure the
Talk
tattoo
about,
is as visible as possible too.
you got it. But, so Chaz, talk a little bit about, to the extent that there isn't Black music represented in so-called traditional classical music, I'm sure the same is true for Latinx. So talk a little bit about sort of your experience in the field. You're sort of at the beginning of your career, yeah?
That's right. I was going to mention that, yeah, I'm a little bit earlier on in my career in this so-called classical music space. Whenever I reference classical music, I put it in quotations, right? Because it's a misnomer. And the thing is, I'm gonna just go in a little bit about me, and then talk about a little bit of the issues that I faced in the field as I've grown up. So, I like Garrett have been on the orchestral route. I've been training my whole life, like an Olympian, right, to play in an orchestra, an institution that, when we really critically think about the institution itself, perpetuates the status quo of systemic racism and white supremacy, right? And so, because I'm earlier on, because there's this kind of what I call the colonized mind, right? Where as we grow up in this classical music space, with even the misnomer itself, we're kind of taught that this is the pinnacle, the epitome of what music is and what music can be, which is a complete lie, right? And it's not the whole story. It's not the whole truth. It's part of the truth, if that. And so growing up with that mindset, being taught to me either through teachers, or just, it's not a spoken thing. It's an unspoken kind of underlying theme that as classical students we are supposed to understand. So growing up in that way, now as I've always had that tug, seeing that I wasn't represented on stage. I didn't have the same opportunities, nor did I have the same access or resources as my white counterparts, right? So in that, I start to realize, well, is this space really for me? Is this space somewhere where I'm welcome? Is this space somewhere that I actually want to be? So then I ask myself that now, in this very moment, and have this cognitive dissonance, right? Because this is what I've trained for my whole life. My dream when I first started at the program Rosie's House here in South Phoenix in Arizona, Rosie's House is a music academy that provides free lessons to under-resourced youth. I asked myself, my teacher asked me at that time, what do you want to do with the flute? You know, this is a 13-year-old Mexican-American boy, right? Poor, or socioeconomically disadvantaged, if we're going to make pretty words out of it. I grew up poor, South Phoenix. And my answer was, I want to be the principal flutist of the New York Philharmonic, not knowing that at this moment where we stand, that that's the furthest from what I ever wanted, right? I do not want to be in a space that perpetuates systemic racism. I do not want to be in a space where I'm not welcome, where I'm not represented, and where I'm not valued, where my voice and even my presence isn't valued. And so in this time, I'm in my artist diploma program at CCM, the University of Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music, finishing up. Next semester is going to be my last semester. I'm like, well, that's where this cognitive dissonance comes in. You know, so either I can continue on the orchestral route, you know, trying to take auditions however they turn, because we're in COVID, there's not really any auditions right now, and go into the orchestral system and try to change it within, or I completely divest from it, make my own institution that is made up of civic artist leaders that use music, not classical music, right? Music as a tool for social justice and community building and healing, because we all know we need that. So that's kind of the space where I've been lately, you know, honestly. And so, yeah, I mean, as I said, I've come from a place of not having, right, under-resourced, of not having the access, not having the resource, not having the money. It's an issue of money. That's always been what it is for me. And we know that to study this so-called classical music, to be a so-called classical musician, it's very expensive. It's a lot of money, right? So the second part of the question was that how has that affect my projects, right? How has that
you choose to do? Yeah.
Right. And so one of the things is figuring out how I can create a space where BIPOC, us BIPOC are welcomed, where we are, where our voices are heard, where our voices are uplifted and celebrated. That's one thing. And that's in the works, and that's going to be a lifelong project, right? And in every action that I do. But in my master's, I served as a teaching artist for Harmony Project Phoenix. That was my response from having taken free private lessons at Rosie's house when I was in my adolescent and in my teens, to provide the students in my neighborhood, because Harmony Project Phoenix, actually all the students lived in my exact same neighborhood, to the same schools that I went to in the same school district, and had actually some of the same teachers that I had in their regular classrooms, their homeroom classrooms. Was to provide them not only a role model as a person of color, as a Mexican American, in the space, and that it is possible, but also to provide them this music instruction that they wouldn't have otherwise had. You know, these schools didn't have that instruction at that time. So that was one of the things that I did. And then I went on, right, I finished that position because I had to go on to Cincinnati because I was pursuing my orchestral pursuit, right? And at the beginning of the pandemic, it was around March, I applied for the National Orchestral Institute Sphinx Orchestral Future Fellowship, which I wasn't originally going to do. But I did apply. I had a friend that really pushed me for it, and I got the fellowship. And so now I'm building a youth mentorship program through National Orchestral Institute's platform, so that we can build a cyclical program that is more for BIPOC musicians to then be in the program. But in the college level program, right, there's a lot of steps there in between before even getting into a college level summer music festival. So the whole premise of the work is providing access and the resources to BIPOC students that wouldn't have that, so that they can have an entry point, exposure point to music. And again, there's cognitive dissonance there, because I'm like, am I going to teach the students to play an orchestra in a space where they're not feeling welcome? Or am I going to create my own institution, again, that puts the community at the core, made up of civic artist leaders, not playing music for mere entertainment, but music for a function, again, for social justice.
I choose choice 2 for you.
Yeah.
I think so too.
If we're voting, you know, I think you know, I'm just sort of pulling nuggets from what you guys are saying. So in addition to being as visible as possible, right, and sort of speaking into a space where you are elevating your voices, and then also providing access that either you didn't get or you got and you want to expand. And, you know, I think for some of our folks on the criminal justice reform side, there's a lot of that too, right? There's the cognitive dissonance being experienced by Black prosecutors, Black public defenders who are in spaces looking around saying, the only other people who look like me here are on the defendant side of the table. And so struggling with, how do you make change in a space that doesn't actually want you to make too much change? They would really just prefer you come in, you show up, you be the diversity, but you just keep going with the status quo the way that it is. So I want to, before we even go further into any other pieces, I do want to pull in the piece that you brought tonight, Garrett. So we're gonna turn off our cameras. We're gonna move into a piece that Garrett brought us, and I hope all of you enjoy it.
water. See the children, they're dressed up in blue. You know my God's gonna trouble the water. Yeah, I see it looks like my people, they're coming on through. Well, my God's gonna trouble the water.
Well, everybody knows it's
wait in the water. Wait in the water. Children, wait in the water. Children, wait in the water. Wait in the water. My God's gonna trouble the water.
See those children dressed in red. My God, He's gonna trouble the water. You know it must be the children that Moses led. My God, He's gonna trouble the water.
See those children all dressed in green. God's gonna trouble the water. You know they're moving down to that Jordan stream. Well, God's gonna trouble the water. Come on, children, wade in the water, my children. Wade in the water, my children. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, my God's gonna trouble the water.
No, some say Peter and some say Paul.
My
My
God,
God, my God. Well, you know there ain't but one God made us all. God's gonna trouble the water. Everybody gonna just wait on
wade in the water,
wait in
children.
the water.
Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water.
Wade in the water,
children. Wade in the water, my children. Wade in the water. You know my God's gonna trouble the water. Wade, my God's gonna trouble the water. I know my God's gonna trouble the water. My God's gonna trouble. Well, my God's gonna trouble the water.
God is gonna trouble the water.
Let's just all take a minute.
It's a great piece.
I'm way behind on my timeline, and y'all know that from the run of show. So you're just gonna have to bear with me for a second, because I'm gonna squeeze like a lot of what I wanted to hear from you into like 2 seconds. But really, Garrett and Alysia, if you would, for the viewers, explain why that's classical music.
Yeah. So I wanted to start. So over the weekend, I took a little break and I watched the 30-year anniversary of The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and I was reminded of a scene. And I looked up the quote that I wanted to share today. So basically, Janet Louise Hubert, or the first Aunt Viv, as we call her, is talking to Will about what it really means to be pro-black. He has on these Malcolm X T-shirts and is holding up the power fist, but she didn't think it was enough. So Aunt Viv, she says, you can read the book, you can wear the shirt, you can even shout the slogans, but unless you know all the history behind it, you're trivializing the entire entire struggle. I bring that quote up because American ensembles and American so-called classical music institutions have trivialized the entire conversation of diversity by not really understanding the entire history. So the question is, what makes that classical music? So as I spoke to earlier, every culture around the world has a tradition of music that is classic to that culture and classic to those experiences, classical music. When we talk about the United States, we have a lot of imports. Orchestral music was imported. There were so many other sounds that were imported. And with the exception of the music codified by indigenous people here in the United States, there is no other non-imported music than the Negro spiritual. It's the only form of American music that really grew up from the soil and was not imported. So when we talk about American music, we have to acknowledge that all American music is Black music. I'll say that again. All American music is Black music, certainly classical music. Now, when you add in systemic racism into the cake mix, you can understand why the reverberations of that Negro spiritual, the blues, the jazz, the gospel, even some of the orchestral music rooted in those traditions, you can understand why it was siloed to the side and not included in the traditions that were being presented in so-called classical music in the United States. One of the projects that I've been doing, I won't spend too much more time, but one of the projects that I'm working on right now is in collaboration with KVNO FM in Omaha, Nebraska. It's a show on the intersection of the 13th Amendment and classical music. So when we talk about the 13th Amendment, you know, the 1860s, when we talk about 100 years before that, back in the days of Mozart, you know, the mid to late 1700s, there was orchestral music happening and there was slavery happening at the same time. Because of this capitalistic systemic capitalist driven systemic racism, those two worlds were always separate. So fast forward to 2020, we have all of the reverberations of that Negro spiritual, again, the original classical music of America, set to the side, aside from what you hear in the concert hall. This is all systemic racism. So when we talk about turning the corner, when we talk about so-called classical music institutions really engaging the conversation of equitable programming and creating equitable space, in my opinion, the very first step is understanding the entire history, as Aunt Viv said, or you're trivializing the entire struggle. The entire history when it comes to American music, certainly American classical music, begins with the Negro spiritual. And if we don't center those aesthetics and that type of music and the music that has grown from that, we will never understand what America is. We will never understand American music, American classical music, and these spaces that we want to diversify so much will never be that. We have to make sure that we're really centering that truth and that perspective to really understand how we can move forward.
That's so true. And the reason I chuckled so is because I never knew that everybody didn't know that all American music is Black music. I really had no idea of that. Shout out to Andrea Kalin, the current dean of New England Conservatory, who was my
Yeah,
who was
never-
my history teacher. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I was taught. I was taught that by a white Canadian woman. I thought everyone in the world knew that all American music was Black music, that all American music is rooted really in the Negro spirituals. I thought everybody knew that. It's fascinating to me that people didn't. And I learned that people didn't and I got older. So shout out to Dr. Kalin for giving us this truth. And maybe sometimes it takes a Canadian to come in and just tell us what's clear on the nose in our face. What's so important, I think about what Garrett is talking about, of course, is this revealing of the truth, right? It's really about, it's about acknowledging the contribution that Black people have made, not just to music, but to the world. Yeah, a year ago, there was an interview with that made national news where a white supremacist asked the news anchor, if Black people are so great, what have they contributed to society? What have they contributed? And the news anchor really had no response. He did not know. He couldn't name one thing where a Black person has contributed to civilization or to society. That's a real shortcoming of our education system. That's a real shortcoming of our cultural values. And so we as musicians, I always tell people if I was a scientist, I would do something different, but I'm a musician, I'm a singer. So for me, it's about creating a model, doing the thing that I love to do. That's what my organization, Sister Cities Girlchoir, is all about. It's creating a model that is extolling the benefits of music and the benefits of community and space. That's what this is all about. So people ask us, do we sing classical music? And my girls will tell you, yeah, we sing spirituals. Yes, we sing spirituals all the time. We sing Wade in the Water a lot. We sing that. In fact, we sing that version. Shout out to Dr. Barnwell. So, this idea of reframing for young people and for their communities, what music is and what music isn't, right? That is such an important part of this conversation, is what music is and what music isn't, what music does and what music doesn't do. When we see the fruits of the ways, the fruits of racism. You mentioned, the small percentage on the concert stage. Like, none of that is a shock to any of us. I mean, I've been Black my whole life, not just part of it. So it's not shocking to me that, in an American institution, racism is embedded thoroughly, right? What is shocking to me is that in all of the art forms, classical music. Now, I'm not saying that theater and dance have rid themselves of racism. But what I am saying is in all of the other art forms, dance, visual art, what we are seeing is a change and a shift towards voice and agency that we do not see in classical music. Classical music continues to sit at the bottom of the barrel. And by the bottom of the barrel, I just mean the most uninteresting form of music making. That is for the most elite person. It's a very strange dichotomy there, right? So the reason it sits there and continues to sit there is because classical music, because of its supreme attachment to white supremacy, people will say it's supreme attachment to tradition. Don't let them say that. It's their extreme attachment to white supremacy. They will not allow voice and agency. You cannot go into I work at the State Department of Education. So shout out to all my State Department of Education people. I oversee public school fine arts education for Maryland students. So almost 1 million students in music, dance, theater, visual art, media art. You will not walk into a dance classroom and see people recreating dances. You will not walk into a visual art classroom and see people recreating Van Gogh paintings. You will walk into a theater classroom. Sure, the kids might do a play, a Shakespearean play or something, but they also are devising work. They're learning how to share their ideas through the art form. Classical music, we take who we think are the cream of the crop and those people's ideas. And by the cream of the crop, it means that most people with the most access to funding to provide the training that is needed, right, to be the most musically literate person. Those folks are the composers. Those folks are the mouthpiece. All of the other art forms have shifted away from that. Music, classical music, and sits in that same place. We are working the system the wrong way. Instead of bringing more folks to the table, we are continuing to create this narrow sieve where, again, folks with the most access to resources rise to the top. There is no good that can come from that. We are not then putting the best forward. We are putting the best of the most resource forward. So at the very best, we're getting, if there's 100 composers that are graduating from conservatories every year, 1 or 2 might be great. 1 or 2 versus if we had figured out ways from our education system, not just to create more opportunities for kids to put their hands on bassoons, but more opportunities for kids to feel like I'm in music class, I create music. I'm a creator and a consumer. And the other art forms are way ahead of us. And I used to rack my brain to think, why is classical music so stuck? But it has to be this white supremacy. It has to be this unacknowledgement of first of all, that children and people of color and women and LGBT community have ever made any contribution and that they could in the future. It has to be that. I can't think of anything else. And until we get rid of that, until we start to, and the other things everyone else has said, our music form stays as a museum. It stays as a monument to things of the past, and it has no space to grow. And we want, this is all of our favorite music. We want this music to continue, but we've got to make that space. We've got to make that mind shift as a collective.
I'm going to very quickly address something that I'm seeing in the chat, and I want to reiterate it just to make sure that it's on the record here. So with as I said before, with the exception of the music codified by indigenous populations. All American music is Black music, and I think there's a teaching moment in this. So often, when Black people, certainly Black folks who work in so-called classical music in any capacity, come with some sort of issue or some sort of statement that seems a little radical or a little outside of the framing of what we've been taught, there's instant doubt and there's instant questioning of what we said. So once again, I want to make sure that we reiterate, with the exception of the music codified by indigenous Americans,
I
all
think that was
American
very
music
clear.
is Black music. That was very clear, but
Yeah, I think it was very
but
clear.
I want to underscore that, because in these conversations, it's so quick. We're so quick to get off the track and accuse Black and brown people of miscontextualizing things or forgetting about certain things. So I wanted to actually make, and I'm not going to name the people here in the chat who weren't actually listening to me, but I want to just name that as a learning opportunity here. Really sit back and listen to what Black and brown folks are saying in classical music, because more often than not, you can learn something and you might have actually even misunderstood something. So for the fifth time, with the exception of the music codified by indigenous people here in North America, all American music is Black music.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, country music is Black music, pop music is Black music, blues is Black music, pop is Black music, from Adele to Beyonce to the Rolling Stones. This music that comes, that has centrally based from America. I know the Rolling Stones are from other places, but you get what I'm saying. That rock and roll is from us, okay? So all of that music is Black music. We have to acknowledge that. Again, I thought everyone was learning this in their music classes. So shout out to University of North Carolina for making sure that we're all aware. And we have to make sure that, like Chaz's students that he's working with, that they know that they are not just recreators. How boring is that?
Yeah. So let me
That they are makers.
bring Jim in.
Ah,
Jim, it's not that I forgot you were here. We just, we got carried away. But Nat Phil has been thinking and working this year on this issue. Like us, you're at the beginning of a long and never-ending journey. But I want to bring you in to talk a little bit about, and we may or may not be able to get to the piece that you brought in, but we can share it in the green room for sure. So can you just share with us, sort of like, you're hearing all this, but this started for you guys last year. What do you want to say?
So first of all, I'm extremely humbled to be just at the table here. And I've learned a lot from listening to the panelists. But my first day, I would say last year, when I walked into National Philharmonic, I was a musician on the stage prior to that, but walking in as president, I really started to look at what the business model that National Philharmonic had. And it was a failing business model where the audience was dwindling, and we really had to really look at what we were doing and what we were thinking about. And I have to give a shout out to Susan Jenkins of the Arts and Humanities Council, who brought a training for all of the executive directors in Montgomery County. And we did a race forward training that started last November. And to go with what Garrett was saying, to learn the history, and this by any means was not the whole source of the knowledge that I need to go seek as part of my education to understand, but it was the beginning of really being eye-opening to what our business model was, and that we were alienating a lot of people in our own county and our own state, and the people that were coming to our concerts were getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's just really interesting to me. My predecessor and our music director, Peter Gajewski, they designed a concert right before the pandemic that featured Black classical pioneers. And I was worried going into that concert that it would be a pandering type situation, and would it be well received? And we sat down at the first rehearsal, and I also identify as a violist in the orchestra, and we played the Afro-American Symphony by William Grant Still. And it was the first time I played that music in my entire life. Why was that the first time I played that? I didn't know much about William Grant Still until that very point, and I started to read about his background, being the first African-American conductor to lead the LA Phil in the 30s. And it was just really, really powerful. And that concert was so energizing and the music was so great. Just loved it. The audience was very thankful, and it was a completely different look out in the audience than what we typically see. And so Peter, our music director, and I talked about, wow, that was just such a great experience. And sometimes you get wrapped up in a business model thinking that, oh, Mozart sells, or oh, this sells, and you're very worried about making decisions outside of the box that you're in. And that was the start of decisions. And then we get into this season now, and we decided that we were going to represent as many artists of color, women composers, as we possibly could during this COVID season over our 15 concerts. And we set a low threshold of 40% of our programming. And I know Garrett is probably chomping at the bit to ask, why did we come up with that number? But that number was just a benchmark for us to hit to make sure that we were doing at a minimum 40% of composers and artists of color represented in our concerts. And we are making baby steps to move in that direction, and we're learning new music and going outside of our comfort zone. And really this journey for me has been so emotional, because it never occurred to me how my friends felt walking into rehearsals, being the only Black person there, or the person of color. And that was really eye-opening to me. And, it still affects me, even in this moment, that I'm part of an organization that was contributing to keeping white supremacy going, if I may be bold and say that. So I give a shout out to Peter Gajewski for having vision to say it's a no-brainer, let's do this. And I am just grateful for the start of these discussions, and I'm grateful to you, Charisse, for joining our board and really pushing me and really pushing our organization. And let's see what we can do with this. It's what we have to do for everybody.
In my business, just like in your business, coming up with metrics that help us hold us accountable in
Correct.
these community conversations is sort of the next space as well. So much more to dig into. I have ruined our timeline completely because it is 8 o'clock. Garrett has to go off into the world of podcasting, and I know that. So Garrett, I'm going to say you are welcome to drop off right this second. I'm going to take 2 more minutes of everybody else's time in this space. Thank you so much for being here, Garrett, and I hope that
Garrett.
you'll come back and allow us to continue to share who you are with all our communities.
Thank you. Before I leave, I just want to take a couple seconds to give shout outs to some of the folks, members of the TRILLOQUY family who I've seen in the chat. Christine Gangelhoff, who's doing some incredible work down in the Bahamas with these same conversations. I've seen Andrea, AKA The Phoenix, one of the leaders of the Philharmonic Orchestra, in the chat. Huge shout out to her. And for folks, more information about me and my work, GarrettMcQueen.com, TRILLOQUY.org. I'm going to leave on a very trill note. Jim, you said maybe I'm chomping at the bit to wonder why it's that number is 40%. Well, I actually do know. I would imagine that your institution and institutions like yours are worried about the mostly white big donors when you talk about the percentage of diverse programming. Why not 100%? Why not all diverse music? Because large orchestral institutions are still beholden to that white dollar. And I'll speak more on that on the podcast that I'm about to record. So I'll see y'all Wednesday. And thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. Bye, Garrett. So I want to close out. I mean, literally, we could go in a million directions, and I do apologize for having this time fly so quickly. I want to end tonight with the piece that Chaz brought to us. So Chaz, will you introduce this piece that will take us out? I will remind people that we are headed to the green room after this. Jess is already going, so you'll find the link in the chat in a moment. And as we get through this piece, then you can, after you listen to the entirety of the piece, we can move over into the green room and have a conversation. Chaz, will you please introduce this piece that we're closing with?
Absolutely. This piece is Fan Mi Imain by Valerie Coleman. Fan Mi Imain means human family in Haitian Creole, and it's based on Maya Angelou's poem by the same name. The refrain from the poem is, "We are more alike, my friends, than we are unalike." And I chose this piece. One of the reasons why I chose this piece is because it reminds us and celebrates the truth.
Awesome. Thank you, Alysia. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone. Let's enjoy this piece, and we'll see you in the green room, and we'll see you next time on the Nashville PJI webcast series. Bye, everybody.